Ahora invitamos al escenario al doctor Dennis HAHN, director de Medio Ambiente de Regulación de Asia-Pacífico y América Latina para Ethicon, parte de la familia de compañías Johnson & Johnson, quien tiene una amplia experiencia en el registro de dispositivos médicos a nivel mundial. Les recuerdo que si necesitan equipos de traducción simultánea, tenemos dispuestos allá para que lo reclamen. Gracias. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Andy and the organizers for inviting me to speak today. I'm very excited to be here and very happy to be here. My topic for today will cover the UDI, Unique Device Identification, and I'll give you a bit of an overview and a bit of an overview of the United States FDA regulation on unique device identification. And then I'll also talk a little bit about the implementation of unique device identification from an industry and a manufacturer's perspective. And then following that, I will also talk a little bit about global medical device nomenclature and talk about how that connects to the unique device identification. As way of a background, it's always important to understand why why was UDI developed in the United States and why is UDI being developed globally. Primarily because in the US and most markets around the world, pharmaceuticals are uniquely identified either through a national drug code or through some sort of a barcoding system. Barcoding is mandatory in many markets. Unfortunately, such a system has not existed for medical devices. And just simply putting medical devices into the pharmaceutical systems would create all sorts of complexities and difficulties. So what has happened is that the United States FDA and other regulators are really mandating unique device identification rules and are starting to write regulations. UDI can have many benefits. And the potential benefits of a unique device identification are to potentially reduce medical errors from misidentification of devices or confusion about the appropriate use of medical devices. Certainly can assist and help in more accurate reporting and analysis of adverse events, provide useful information. If a fully functioning UDI system is available, it can provide very good information on the types of action so that we can take appropriate focused action, corrective actions, including recalls. Can enhance market analysis, can be linked into electronic health records so that we have more information and better evidence into electronic health records, and really can help to contribute to the better detection of counterfeit devices, which is an issue and a growing issue. So in the United States, UDI is not something that is new. It started with a conversation with the United States Food and Drug Administration in 2005 and created a focus group with the Food and Drug Law Institute to really discuss and talk about the objectives of device identification. In 2007, the United States Congress wrote into the US law that UDI system is now mandatory and will be administered by the Food and Drug Administration in the Food and Drug Amendments Act. And then finally in 2012, a short 5 years later, we finally had the first draft of a proposed regulation. And in September of 2013, the United States FDA published the final UDI regulation. And this is the first and today the only UDI regulation that is being administered by a health agency. As the FDA was developing the UDI regulation, they realized very early on that this was a very large and a very complex system and a very large undertaking. There are hundreds of thousands of medical device products and product codes on the US market. And to mandate everything with a very short transition time was going to be not feasible. It was going to be very difficult. So the FDA decided very early on that they would take a transition period, a very long transition period. So UDI implementation is over the course of 7 years. Implementation is risk-based, So the highest risk devices, the class 3 medical devices in the United States, were the first to be required to have UDI, followed by what are called the implants, life-sustaining and life-supporting products, and then finally the class 2 and class 1 medical devices. So we are not quite halfway into the implementation, into this transition of UDI in the United States, but we have quite a bit of information that we can share. One of the other things that was not considered by the FDA in the draft rule, but industry worked very diligently with the FDA, and that was the fact that the compliance dates for all of the UDI is based upon manufacturing. So devices must be compliant. So the class 3 devices that had a compliance date of 2014 meant that any device, class 3 device that was produced after September 23rd of 2014 must be UDI compliant and have all of the barcodes and things I'll show you in a moment. The problem is there are still many devices in distribution. And so a lot of discussion was, do we need to relabel those devices that were in distribution? What happens to all of that inventory that is already in distribution? So the FDA wrote into the regulation a 3-year inventory depletion so that UDI compliance is based upon the date that product is coming from manufacturing, and then manufacturers have 3 years to deplete the inventory of existing products that are not UDI compliant, which is why the transition period, as you see, is so long. So when we talk about UDI, I think it's very important to understand that UDI is not a number. It is not just a barcode. It is not a single element. UDI is a system, and it is a system for identification. And this system has 3 very important components. One is labeling. So that is the label that is on all of the products, both on the primary package and the secondary packaging. The second part is direct part marking, which is some devices, specifically those devices that are reusable and are reprocessed. So they're either cleaned, disinfected, and sterilized, and then reused again on a patient, will be required to have a UDI identification on the device itself. And then the third part that makes the system effective is the global database, the data submission, which really electronically now connects a lot of this information together. So the UDI compliance, by having these 3 elements, we can declare that we are in compliance with the UDI regulation. It's important to note that while the benefits of UDI has a potential benefit to reduce medical errors, for more accurate reporting of adverse events and useful information for corrective actions, such as recalls, the United States Food and Drug Administration only has authority over manufacturers. So the UDI regulation only applies to manufacturers. It does not apply to hospitals. It does not apply to doctors. So FDA can mandate that manufacturers apply UDI. FDA can mandate manufacturers have to submit adverse event reports or technovigilance reports. However, they can only encourage hospitals and doctors to submit. So UDI, for the UDI system to fully work, it's critical for industry to also engage with our other stakeholders, specifically hospitals and doctors, to ensure that the UDI elements are getting into electronic health records. So on the label, I'll talk a little bit about the label. The UDI, the unique device identification on the label, consists of 2 parts, a device identifier and a production identifier. The device identifier is mandatory information. It is static information, so it does not change from batch to batch, lot to lot. It's specific to the device version or model number. And in the GS1 barcode system, we also reference it as the Global Trade Item Number, or the GTIN, G-T-I-N. And as you can see on the label and the bottom, the information needs to be on the label both in an automated reading system, such as a barcode as I've represented here, but it also must be on human readable form. So must have all of the numbers, must be able to be read by a nurse, by a doctor in the hospital. In terms of the production identifier is conditional information. It is variable. So it's conditional, it's dynamic, and it basically identifies one or more of the following. So either the lot or batch number, the serial number of that device, the manufacturing date or date of manufacture for the device, and the expiration date. And so as you can see, there's a lot of information both on the device identifier, production identifier, that now gets incorporated onto the label, both in the electronic format or the barcode system, as well as the human readable. Direct part marking, as I said earlier, really applies to those devices that are intended to be reusable and reprocessed, cleaned, disinfected, or sterilized before each use. And why do these devices need a marking on the device itself? Because they remain in use for extended periods in the hospital or in the clinic, and they become separated from their labeling. So the packaging is discarded and does not follow that device. So in the FDA regulation, any devices that are defined as reusable that need to be reprocessed must have direct part marking. There is one difference between the direct part marking and the labeling requirement, in that the label requires both human readable and auto identification and a barcode. For direct part marking, manufacturers have a choice of either or. So they can either put a barcode or the human readable information. Of course, if a manufacturer wants to put both, that's obviously acceptable as well. And then the third element of the UDI system is what FDA is calling the Good ID, or the global UDI database. And the database now combines a lot of the information that is both on the label and then information that is used within the supply chain, used by the doctors, the nurses that utilize the devices. And so it combines together into a single database the device identifier information, which includes the agency, the barcoding agency, the device identifier number for your particular device, the information on the labeler or the manufacturer of the device, and then all of the relevant information, including brand name, the version, model, or catalog number. It also combines information on device characteristics that may or may not be on the label. So that would include things like the global medical device nomenclature. Is the device for single use? Does the device contain latex? Latex can cause serious issues. We want to know that information. Is the device a prescription device or over-the-counter? Does the device contain information about the magnetic resonance imaging safety? So is it MR safe? Is it MR unsafe? Or is it MR conditional? Does the device need to be sterilized prior to use? And any other storage and handling information that might come from either the label or the instructions for use of the device. The database also includes a yes or no answer to what production identifiers are used for identification. So as I said earlier, the production identifiers can be either the lot or batch number, manufacturing date, expiration date, or serial number. So that is an or. The database will not take that information. It will not take all of the batch numbers, but what manufacturers will do will indicate which one of those four, or all four, of those identifiers will be incorporated and used on the label. Also takes other information on the device status. Is it a human or a cell-containing device, a kit, a combination product, as well as customer contact information, commercial distribution information. Is it still in distribution or has it been stopped? And then finally, what's important to the regulators in the United States, that regulatory information. What is the status, the classification, what is the pre-market submission number or the license number for the product? And the FDA has done a very nice job in pulling all of this information together, and you can now actually go in, and for the class 3 and the implants, life-sustaining, life-supporting products, you can go in and search FDA's database. It's a publicly available database. You can search either by product name, by the device identifier, or by the company name, and you can find all of those products that have actually now been loaded into the global UDI, the database. And FDA's done a very nice job in presenting the information. So I've just give you an example here of one of the medical devices of Johnson & Johnson that is already listed in the UDI database. And finally, when I said it was a system, it's very important to understand that it's not just about putting a label on a medical device, putting a direct part marking, and entering a number into a database. It's about a system, about the controls, about how this connects to the other parts of the regulations in the United States. And so in FDA terminology, we call that conforming amendments. So the UDI regulation also modifies the adverse event reporting, the medical device tracking regulation in the United States, might also be called technovigilance, to ensure that manufacturers are including the UDI information in these reports. It also modifies the recall regulations in the United States so that UDIs will be incorporated into the recall reports from manufacturers, as well as into the quality systems for manufacturers to ensure that the UDIs are updated when the appropriate changes are made, and into the pre-market authorization so that UDIs will be captured into periodic and annual reports for the Class 3 products. Again, these are all of the requirements that FDA can impose on manufacturers as having the authority to regulate manufacturers. The FDA cannot impose these requirements on the hospitals or on the doctors. That they have to be encouraged to do so. So that, in essence, wraps up what I wanted to talk about today. Very briefly go over the UDI, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about global medical device nomenclature and the nomenclature system, which is also an important piece of UDI. And GMDN is really a nomenclature. It's a nomenclature system. And why it's important is because medical devices are traded and used internationally. It's not just a matter of selling and distribution of medical devices, but a medical device can be implanted in a patient in one country, and the patient needs to go for an episode of care in another country. So we truly are a global economy and really can't separate that out. Regulators have a lot of needs. They need to approve devices quickly to classify them into the right product group. They also need to identify systematic failures of medical devices and adverse event reporting and technovigilance. Hospitals can use the system as well to manage inventory and identify those products and group those categories of products together. So what is GMDN? GMDN is it's based on an international standard for naming medical devices. It is based on the ISO 15225 standard. This standard was developed under the ISO Quality Management Technical Committee, and it's based on medical device nomenclature data structure. So it is about naming and the data structure for that naming of medical devices. It's very important to understand that being developed under the quality management structure, the primary purposes, the design intent of this system is for safety and for data exchange for safety adverse event reporting. That is really what GMDN is designed for. It has been adopted by medical device regulators, certainly in the United States under UDI. It's been adopted in Europe. The European notified bodies used GMDN for audit purposes. And then a version of GMDN called the JMDN in Japan has actually been adopted by the Japanese Ministry of Health in Japan. GMDN has been translated to 28 languages, so it is a multilingual database. Just very briefly, where you can find GMDN, it's at the gmdnagency.org. Wonderful website. Everything that they have is web-based, so you can actually go and search for GMDN terminology. But more importantly, you can also see the instructions for how GMDN classifies and names the structure. So a lot of great detailed information on their website. The GMDN term structure, so the actual structure is composed of three parts: the term name or the general name. So in this case, I just give you an example of a general purpose syringe. The definition, which is usually a paragraph description of the product, which really describes the features and the function of the product. And then finally a code, the actual number, 5-digit number that is used by GMDN. That code number is very important because that is what links to the UDI database. That is also what GMDN uses to link to the different translated versions of the GMDN terms. There is a very detailed hierarchy for GMDN terms, so it's not, there's not a random assignment of terms. It is based upon the product identifier, which is the base term, and that identifies individual groups of products. But then it also has other terminology for collective terms for different attributes of medical devices, for example, surgical, or it may give you device material attributes. So is it a polymer device? Is it plastic? Is it made of silicone? Is it metal? Could it be rubber? Could it be made of glass? It also gives some options and some identification of the power and operation. So is it manual? Is it battery operated? Is it electrically operated? Can define it as to device sterility, sterile or non-sterile, device use frequencies, single use, multiple use, and then finally high-level device groups, which really describe the devices, and in this case, under syringes, injectors, and associated devices. And so in conclusion, in summary, I really want to just talk a bit about the relationship of GMDN and UDI, because they do both work together to serve two very different purposes. So the UDI really defines and describes an individual device or a group of devices from a single manufacturer, and that is referenced by the GTIN or the device identifier. The GMDN term now collects all of that information and now gives us information about devices from different manufacturers. So multiple manufacturers may make the same GMDN term. They may make the same generic syringe, but each one will be identified uniquely in the UDI database. So it's very important that linkage. So these two systems really need to work together to be fully effective. One without the other may give us some benefit, but the full benefit of UDI and GMDN is really when we link these systems together. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Hahn. Thank you. Ahora escucharemos a la doctora Jackie Ray Elkin, directora de Procesos Globales de Identificación Estándar de Productos y Corporativa de Operaciones Regulatorias de Medtronic.
Thank you. Thank you to the Andy organization for inviting me here to speak about something that has been near and dear to my heart for about the last 10 years. From the day I got a call from the US FDA to come to their offices and talk to them about this thing they were calling UDI. So thank you, Dennis, for that great overview on UDI, and Dennis and I could probably talk about UDI all day long, so we're going to try and do this quickly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of the world as it relates to UDI. I don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to give it a whirl here. So what I'm going to start out with is the IMDRF, International Medical Device Regulators Forum, formerly known as the Global Harmonization Task Force. GHTF, it was formed long ago where different regulators around the world wanted to come together to try and harmonize on some of the regulatory requirements that medical device manufacturers deal with today. So soon after, they changed the structure of GHTF, and now it's IMDRF. The difference between the two structures now is we have more countries that have joined IMDRF. The countries are represented by their country flags there. And the latest change is it's truly the regulators working together. They invite industry in when industry is needed to help them through different standards. And so I was lucky enough to be invited in as an industry member to IMDRF to help them develop their guidance document that was drafted or finalized and published in December 2013. If you want to see that document, there is a link at the bottom. I can make these slides available to anyone. I'm not going to be able to cover every little detail in them, but please know that they will be available if you would like them. I just want to point out the one important tenet of the IMDRF UDI guidance document is that, and I have it highlighted at the bottom, the framework can be used at a local, national, or global level. And the key to the UDI guidance is that it is critical that this system be used without national or regional differences. So it's really, truly an opportunity to globally harmonize. And now we go on to UDI and the whole world watching to see what is going on with UDI. I'm going to start with this slide. I know it's hard to read from where you are, but it's just to give you a high-level overview. I'll go into more detail later. I just would like to share with you the implementations above the green line, the IMDRF guidance. These are implementations that were started well before anyone thought of UDI. And as you can see, the standards used in these implementations are very consistent. You'll see GS1 throughout all of these implementations. How many in the room know who GS1 is? Can you raise your hands? Okay. I brought my water bottle to show you. This UPC code that you see literally on everything in retail, that's GS1. To give you an idea how global GS1 is. They do have a local office here in Bogota, and they work internationally. They are truly the global language of healthcare that allows us to cross borders without re-identifying our product. So the labeling requirements, you can see the labeling requirements and all of those implementations are basically the same. They want the device identifier, production identifier, down to the unit of use. And then the data reporting. This is interesting. Before IMDRF, these implementations were all specifically related to reimbursement. They were not. Today, our UDI is more focused on post-market surveillance, but here, these regulatory authorities are using these standards for reimbursement purposes. And then we have the USA implementation, Dennis covered, and then Argentina. And I will talk a little bit more about Argentina. Here's the overview of the US. I won't go into this again. This is my time chart, like Dennis's time chart, of the dates we need to pay attention to and what's important to us as device manufacturers. And then we'll move on to Argentina, and I'm sorry for that overlap there. I don't know how that happened. So ANMAT, this is not referred to as UDI, but ANMAT has a regulation on traceability. And it actually requires tracking and reporting from manufacturing through the supply chain into the hospital, and the hospital has some responsibility here as well for reporting on these devices, but they've really taken this whole concept to another level, a level of what we always refer to as track and trace. But the thing you need to be mindful of, this level of tracking requires serialization at every point, which is quite a tall order for all devices. But as you can see, Argentina has taken a risk-based approach in their implementation. They're focusing on the implantable high-risk products first. You can see the 2 timelines have come and gone, and we're up and running in Argentina. And from what I hear from my colleagues in Argentina, all is going well. So here's the future. as we know it today. So, and I'll go into more detail so you don't have to strain your eyes looking at this. But we start our next implementation, we expect, in Europe. We know we've been working with the European Commission on some of their new medical device regulation. And I'll get into the specifics, and I have a whole slide on that. But again, I just want to show you, look at the standard column. If you can see, you're seeing the same standards in use, the same standards that were used before UDI, that are used in UDI now, and that we anticipate and will be used in UDI in the future. A lot of the same labeling requirements. We're seeing the same thing as well. Data reporting systems, of course, are different. They have to be to accommodate the national, regional regulatory requirements. So that's an expected. So first we'll start with Europe. We started with a medical device proposed regulation, and then the European Commission drafted a recommendation on UDI, and at this moment the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council are working together in what they call a trilogue. And this is a time period where the three bodies get together and they decide what that final medical device regulation is going to look like. And we've been notified as early as last month that they have now decided that UDI will be part of that regulation. It will not be its own separate delegated act as we had thought in the beginning. So we can anticipate the trilogue to wrap up in December, and the first quarter of 2016 we expect to have a draft release of a medical device a release of the medical device regulation, and probably with an effectivity date in the second quarter of 2016. Moving on to China. China's been at this for a while, a few years at least, and this past year they did publish a draft. It wasn't publicly released very widely. It was released to industry organizations. But China's taking a little bit different approach, we think. They acknowledge the GS1 standards. Our global standards it's a good idea, but they also are thinking they might want to add a national component. But as we just heard, IMDRF, that is not what the IMDRF guidance suggests to those regulators. China will take a similar approach in their database as the US has, and they have said they will use the GMDN, but they have also developed their own nomenclature, much like Japan, as Dennis had referred to. They notified us in their Chinese, Dennis, the CIMDR, Chinese International Medical Device Regulators Forum, all these acronyms. They said that they've already assigned 20% of the medical devices in China to their CMDN. Moving on to Turkey. Turkey has had a great implementation. They have a wonderful database that encompasses their registration and reimbursement, and they've put a lot of thought into it. And again, they use the GS1 standards. They're also offering the option to use the HIBIC, Healthcare Industry Business Communication Standard. And so they have quite a few devices, as you can see, in their database, 2.5 million. But it's worth noting that 92% of those devices have a G10, are following the GS1 standard. So that's a significant amount following the GS1 global standard. Turkey has now informed us that they're working on a new project, and they're going to replace that former database. That database was called the TIT-UBB. And they're going to focus on product tracking. And again, using the same standards. And they're really working with industry to get industry feedback on what they think will work. Obviously, they know industry has a stake in the game. We both want this to work, so they've really engaged with industry this past year. We're expecting a June 2017 go live, and they are using the GMDN, but they are using it as a nomenclature. They are not using it as their reimbursement key. They are using the GS1 standards for the reimbursement key. Health Canada, they have said they are in the stages of developing their UDI legislation. We can expect something probably next year. And they have committed to following the IMDRF guidance as a member of IMDRF. So we can expect to see the same standards and the same data structures of the IMDRF guidance. And then we have India, the Ministry of Health, Welfare, and Drug and Cosmetic rule, and you're probably wondering, well, this is about devices. Well, under the Indian Drug and Cosmetic Act, there are about 15 devices that are notified actually as drugs. There are things like pacemakers, there's stents, there's a whole list of things that you would not think were drugs, but in India, they are notified as drugs. So we will have to comply in that manner. Again, they are asking for the GS1 standards, the same type of information, the device identifier, production identifier, and then they want that entire data hierarchy loaded into their central database. Saudi Arabia, they've announced their intent recently. They are really going to follow the US FDA final rule lockstep. When they announced their high-level overview, it looked pretty much like the US FDA, down to the data, to the messaging standard they're going to use. So they are well aligned as well with FDA and IMDRF. And then we have Brazil. Brazil, as a member of IMDRF, had committed to following the IMDRF, but since that time, I understand the responsibility for UDI and ANVISA has changed. I don't know what that means, if you're curious. It's just a data point. So what we're hearing is the draft legislation may be available for public consultation by the end of this year, if not next year. We've learned that there's a university working with ANVISA discussing classification of medical devices, and they're working with the assistance of GS1 Brazil. And part of that discussion is the appropriate use of GMDN. And Taiwan, I added this one on my way here because I just got the email that told me about it. Taiwan has released their draft guidance on UDI, and just last month. But its implementation is voluntary. It does provide references to the US UDI rule and IMDRF, and it does mention the same issuing agencies. Because my Chinese is worse than my Spanish, I can't tell you what it actually says, but I can read those words in English. So that's my understanding of what we can expect in Taiwan. And here, I just have a couple pages. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to give you an idea of how these three rules are aligned on certain points. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's enough to give you an idea of where the three that have gone forward and published are aligned and where they are not exactly aligned. So these this list of things, they all say the manufacturers are responsible. They all have requirements for marking the UDI in human readable and AIDC format. That's that barcode Dennis talked about. And they all require reusable products that need disinfectant sterilization in between use in between patients. They require direct marking on those products. And they are telling us, the manufacturers, or labelers as FDA refers to us, are responsible for submitting data to the database before you can put the product on the market. So you cannot distribute your product or put your product into commerce in the US until your data is in the database. The others are saying the same is true. GMDN, of course, is an attribute, a key component of UDI. And all three give an exception for manufacturing date. They say if you need it to control your product, include it in the UDI. But if it's not your only identifier, you do not need to include it. In here, we have a little variation. The one thing at the top that is also near and dear to my heart are the HL7, the Health Level 7 structured product labeling standards. HL7 has a series of messaging standards that have been used in healthcare globally for years and years and years. And what we hope to see is that the regulators, in the name of harmonization, agree to adopt these globally harmonized standards. They're messaging standards that allow consistent data to flow from the manufacturers into the regulator system. And it just ensures the integrity of that. It's very structured. And it really helps both parties ensure that the data is valid. We have transparent mechanisms for adjudicating. The FDA has done a wonderful job in having a help desk that we can refer to questions. And if we have issues, we ask for exceptions, they consider them. Sometimes they're accepted, sometimes not, but it's a great process. Point of sale on devices is a little different. Some of the US says they want both device and production identifier. The others say just the device identifier. And the direct marking requirements are slightly different between the two. The existing inventory exemption Dennis talked about, we only see that in the US. That's an important piece. What do we do with all that inventory that is built up prior to the compliance date? IMDRF threw a little twist in there. They said serial numbers are required for active implantables. I don't think that's earth-shattering. I think that happens anyway. But they've also given an exception to the orthopedic trays that are distributed in a non-sterile, unpackaged format. They're distributed in caddies and trays. They don't have packages. They don't have labels. So they gave an exception there. And then the European Commission is taking a bit of a different approach to UDI. They're requiring UDI as a pre-market submission. FDA has focused on UDI as a post-market activity. We can expect other regulators to also adopt a pre-market submission approach to UDI. So why is it so important for all of these things to align? Here are a list of things that we talk about. Obviously, the efficiency and accuracy in being able to automate that scan and capture of data. It gives us global visibility to our supply chain movement, the movement of product through our global supply chain to the patient. It provides a better means to perform post-market surveillance globally. It also allows the healthcare providers to automate the process of being able to capture that data automatically and getting it into the healthcare records of the patients. And that automation really drives accuracy and consistency at the end of the day. And that wraps up my presentation. Thank you very much.